I'm here with Valerie Plame. Valerie, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Josh.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm very excited to speak with you. I want to speak as much as we can about your background, of course, the infamous leak, if the name Plame sounds familiar to people, and of course, what you're doing now. Before we scale all that ground, on the off chance that we do have someone that might not be familiar with you and who you are, how would you describe yourself?
I am a former covert CIA operations officer. I was outed by the Bush administration in 2003. I went on to write a book, a memoir about that crazy time called Fair Game. It was made into a movie with Sean Penn and Naomi Watts. I wrote a couple spy thrillers. My passion and my expertise in the CIA has always been the nuclear threat. I've spoken out and tried to be an advocate for nuclear counterproliferation. I'm a mother of twins who just graduated from college, and I ran for Congress in 2019. And I hope that there's still another opportunity to serve my country. And I like to think of myself as an activist as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Valerie. I appreciate it. And we'll no doubt track through a good bit of that as we go along. So then winding the clock back, Valerie, I'd love to ask you, what made you decide to join the CIA?
I come from a family of military service. My father served as an Air Force officer in World War II, made that his career. My brother was a Marine in Vietnam. He was wounded. And when I was given the opportunity to join the CIA, I thought it sounded like it was a really cool option. I wanted to see the world. The government was going to pay for it. This was during the time of the Soviet Union, so it was very clear who was wearing the black hats and who were wearing the white hats. And I was young, so I didn't really know what I was getting myself into at all. But it turned out that I was good at it and I loved it. And as I mentioned, I developed over time my expertise on the nuclear threat. And I think that and climate change are the only two, they are existential threats that if you ignore them, it's at our own peril.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Valerie. I would agree with you. So really excited to speak with you also about your career with the CIA and your so to speak highlights and accomplishments. I found out that the agency took the position that you're not allowed to acknowledge affiliation prior to 2002. So I'll ask you and our mutual audience to bear with me. But perhaps I'll start here and let's see where it takes us. Could you please share your experience, Valerie, working as a non-official cover operative in Athens and Brussels?
Of course, but I can not confirm my covers. I did hold a variety of covers over the years, which is not unusual. I lived and worked in Europe and the Middle East. My primary target was, as I mentioned, the nuclear threat, whether it's rogue nation states or black marketeers. I worked on the team that helped bring down A.Q. Khan, who was a Pakistani nuclear engineer who became an engineer and entrepreneur who, if not for him, and he died a year ago maybe, if not for A.Q. Khan, we really would not be speaking about a nuclear program in North Korea or Iran. He was that big a deal. So I was so proud to serve my country and I loved what I did. Yes, there's like any job, there's boring bits and pieces, but every once in a while you feel that you're doing something that's really worthwhile and it's something large, serving something bigger than yourself. And that provides a great deal of satisfaction.
Yeah, absolutely. I could only imagine. How did assuming different professional roles enhance your ability to gather intelligence?
Well, that's quite common, of course, because if you walk up to someone at a cocktail party and say, "Hi, I work for the CIA. Maybe you'd like to share intelligence of a very sensitive nature from your country to my country," that usually doesn't go over very well. So as a result, you need to assume different legends, different guises, covers, whether you could still ostensibly be working for the US government, but not as CIA, State Department, other ones. Or you could be working for Acme Storm Door. And you're, moving through the world in that way. But ultimately, there comes a time when you need to drop that cover after you have developed your target, and you need to come clean, drop the fig leaf, as it were. But hopefully, if you've done it right, neither one of you is terribly surprised at the answer. It can go south, and of course you do what's called a cold pitch sometimes, where you have no other opportunity, but there's someone of a great deal of interest to United States national security, and maybe this person has come out for a conference and it's the first time you're able to reach him, and you do have to say, I work for the CIA and would like your cooperation, and here's why. So you don't really know how that will go. But if you've had the luxury of developing someone over weeks, months, even years, it shouldn't come to a surprise to anyone that it seems like the next natural evolution of that very intimate relationship.
Wow, that's extraordinary. Thank you, Valerie. So at the time of the leak, which we'll get into momentarily, what was your official position with the CIA?
I was undercover. I was working at CIA headquarters. To the rest of the world, at that time, I think I just had a sort of generic consulting cover. But what I was actually doing was working on at the time of my outing in July 2003, I was working in the Counterproliferation Division on the Iraq Task Force, which basically meant we were trying to gather and sort through all the intelligence that was coming in regarding particularly weapons of mass destruction, but particularly the nuclear threat, because this is what the Bush administration, President Bush and Vice President Cheney had identified as the threat, an imminent nuclear threat from Iraq. So my group, that's what we were doing. We were running sources around the world, excuse me, trying to get to the bottom of what Saddam Hussein really had or didn't have.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Valerie. So, let me see. I think I'll queue up our discussion on the leak this way. I do have a basic timeline that we can track through after, but I'd actually like to begin by playing you an excerpt I pulled from Real Time with our friend Bill Maher. I know you appeared on it, and here's a 1.5-minute long clip I pulled that I would just like to play for you and get your thoughts on after.
Sure.
And purposefully outed a CIA agent, Valerie Plame. That's not treason anymore, outing a spy? Did I mention it was one of our spies? And how despicable that Bush's lackeys attempted to diminish this crime by belittling her service, like she was just some chick who hung around the CIA. An intern, really. Groupie, if you want to be mean about it. No, big lie. Valerie Plame was the CIA's operational officer in charge of counter-proliferation, which means she tracked loose nukes. So when Bush said, as he once did, that his absolute #1 priority was preventing terrorists from getting loose nukes, okay, that's what she worked on. That's what she devoted her life to, staying undercover for 20 years, maintaining 2 identities every day. This is extraordinary service to your country. Valerie Plame was the kind of real-life secret agent George Bush dreams of being when he's not too busy pretending to be a cowboy or a fighter pilot. CIA agents are troops. This was a military assassination of one of our own, done through the press, ordered by Karl Rove. He said of Valerie Plame, quote, "She's fair game." Because let's not forget why they did it to her. Because Valerie Plame was married to this guy, Joe Wilson, who the Bush people hated because he busted them on one of their bullshit reasons for invading Iraq.
All right. Apologies for any length there, Valerie. But
you gotta love Bill Maher. I mean, he somehow manages, like Jon Stewart, the best of the comedians, to wring some a laugh or two out of very serious business.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you have any initial thoughts about the clip other than that?
Well, he was very generous, but everything he said was the truth.
Yeah.
The Bush White House and their allies tried very hard, and for a long time, because they control the narrative, they really did try to diminish me, that I wasn't covert, that I had sent my husband to Niger to find out about this yellow cake uranium thing, that everyone knew that I worked for the CIA, that, oh, I was just literally, I had a Republican congressman say that I was a glorified secretary.
Jack Kingston.
My hair just wants to, my head just wants to spin around. And so it was a full court press to make the story about Joe Wilson and Valerie Plame, rather than the fact that no WMD was found in Iraq, which was the reason we went to war, why we asked our servicemen and women to die and to kill in our name. And it was predicated on lies. And now I think here we are 20 years on. This March, we celebrated 20 years of the invasion. I still don't think our country has come to terms with that. What it meant when our president and his administration lied to the American people about one of, the most important thing in national security, which is declaring a war and going in. And we haven't really come to terms with that yet. And the leak of my name and all the political madness that ensued in the aftermath, and it went on for quite a few years after the actual leak, it served to further erode the people's trust in our democracy and our leaders. Fast forward to 2016, Trump, he's not the reason or the cause for our disequilibrium now in our democracy. He certainly took advantage of the years that had come previously.
Yes, perhaps he's an agitating agent. Might not be the cause, but an agitator, to put it mildly.
Definitely, he put the match to the gasoline. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, agreed. Yeah, and for our listeners, the congressman was Jack Kingston, and the direct quote, yes, ma'am, and the direct quote was, "We need to find out whether she was a real spy or a glorified secretary." End quote. Ridiculous.
I'd love to find. I'll look him up. I wonder where he is now. I'm back in Georgia. I don't know if he's still in Congress or not. I don't think so.
I don't believe he is, but I could be wrong. So in any event, moving through that in that way. So July 6, 2003, former Ambassador Joe Wilson, your husband at the time, now ex, who's sadly passed, writes an op-ed in the New York Times. This is titled "What I Didn't Find in Africa," criticizing, as you point out, Valerie, the Bush administration's claim that Iraq had sought to acquire uranium from Niger. So my question is going to be, when were you first aware of the op-ed, and did you have any indication or sense that it could cause trouble for you?
It came out July 7, 2003. I knew that for the previous months, Joe had been trying very hard to get to the bottom of the so-called 16 words in President Bush's State of the Union address of January 2003, where he talks that we have learned that Saddam Hussein has sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. Joe knew otherwise, but why did this speech, the State of the Union, is the most highly vetted speech that a president gives in any given year. So how did that line get in there? So he's quietly going behind the scenes and speaking to his former colleagues at the State Department and on the Hill to say, how did this happen? So ultimately, there were a couple other precipitating events, but he decided he was going to write this op-ed, "What I Did Not Find in Africa." And he spoke about his trip to Niger the year before at the behest of the CIA, not me, to go get to the bottom of this alleged transfer of 500 tons of yellow cake uranium. And if it was true, that would be really significant because it would indicate that Saddam Hussein was seeking to reconstitute his nuclear program. And he came back and he was debriefed by the CIA intelligence analyst. He's like, no, there's nothing there. And he thought that he just had done his job as an American. He had these deep, longstanding ties in Africa where he could go and ask those questions. But finally, in July 2003, he wrote the op-ed. I knew about it, as I knew he was, he was speaking. He had been speaking out very, very publicly, very strongly against the war in Iraq. So he was very active. And when I read the op-ed, I did not I was proud of him, but I certainly, neither one of us had any idea of what it would cause, because I felt that my cover was secure. He had already been quite a public figure. He had served in Iraq, he had served in Africa. There's lots of reasons why he had a lot of credibility. And he had dealt with Saddam Hussein during the first Gulf War. The first President Bush called him a genuine American hero. So there were a lot of reasons for him to write this op-ed piece and that they would publish it in the New York Times. Had nothing to do at all with his spouse, who happened to work for the CIA. But a week later, in a column by conservative columnist Robert Novaks, he took exception to this op-ed and sort of said on the margin, oh, and by the way, his wife, Valerie Plame, works for the CIA. And we now know that he was fed that information by several senior White House officials. But at the time, the whole thing just hit at a particular moment in time when the American public was sort of opening their eyes and going, wait a minute, I thought you told us that there was going to be WMD in Iraq. And there's not at all. In fact, they're just looting at the museum. It's just completely unhinged. The wheels are coming off. What's going on? And I think the Bush administration was feeling for that particular moment in time very vulnerable, and they decided to go after Joe Wilson and Valerie Plame, and it became it didn't have to be. They could have it could have been just a one-day story and move on, but they felt obviously very threatened by Ambassador Joe Wilson.
Yeah, very much so, Valerie. Thank you for that. I'm going to track through a little bit of that as well, just in case any of it blew past our audience a little too quickly. Yes, so it was the following week, as you point out, Robert Novaks, the Prince of Darkness, and that's not ad hominem for our listeners. That was his nickname. Publishes an article identifying you as an operative. He cited at the time an unnamed administration official, later revealed to be, I know there's a few names involved here, but Richard Armitage, who says that he did it accidentally. And there are other names, of course, like Scooter Libby, who we'll track through. But that was the name that I read from David Korn's reporting at The Nation.
That's right.
Yes,
yeah,
ma'am.
David did some very good reporting on this when it all came out.
Yeah, he did. I suppose I'll ask you, when did you become aware that Robert Novaks wrote his expose, let's call it?
Weirdly, a few days before it came out, and the story goes like this: there was an acquaintance. Joe's op-ed had come out, so everyone who cares about all of these things, they're talking about this op-ed, this Joe Wilson op-ed, and an acquaintance of Joe Wilson's is in downtown Washington. He's on the street. In fact, he's heading to Joe's office, and he sees Robert Novaks on the sidewalk, and he falls in with him, and they just say, "Oh, gosh, what do you think of?" They start talking about this op-ed, and Novaks says, "Well, I happen to know that Joe Wilson's wife works for the CIA," and so the friend says nothing. They finish their conversation. They go their separate ways. The friend goes to Joe Wilson's office and says, "You won't believe this conversation I just had with Novak. This is crazy that your wife, da, da. So Joe, of course, alerted me right away. A journalist having a covert CIA officer's name is alarming, but it's not totally unprecedented. It does happen. But typically, the agency will reach out to that reporter and just say, you really don't want to go there. This is not information that you need for your story or whatever. And to preserve that cover. And I believe that happened, but the story came out anyway. And to this day, I don't know exactly how that chain happened. I have my suspicions, but I don't know for sure. It would just be speculation. But I do think it was multiple channels, really. I think they were just sort of testing to see how far they can push this, what became this whole storyline of Joe Wilson and Valerie Plame are traitors. How dare they? So forth, so on. It was just, and it all was to distract from the issue at hand, which is, wait a minute, we went to war based on WMD. And there was none. And you guys knew that. And you pressed for this war for a whole bunch of other reasons for another conversation. So, you know, people's lives, in my case, I think of the assets that I had worked with that were affiliated with, you know, associated with me in my network. It put a lot of people, that's why you have secret information, so that you do not endanger your assets.
Right. Understood. Thank you, Valerie. To the extent that you feel comfortable, could you describe how the leak initially impacted your professional and personal life?
It was, well, I'll start with the day that Novak printed his column in the Washington Post. Joe got this is so analog, but you know, we picked up our paper on the front step. We lived in Washington, D.C., and he picked it up early in the morning. We were early birds. This is July, so the sun is up. And he came into the bedroom and he said, well, the SOB did it, except there was a lot of other, there was this column there from Novak about me. And I, you know, we have all experienced, I think, those moments in our lives where, you know, what came before will be different than what is after. And it was a hinge moment for sure. I thought first my twins, 3-year-old twins, were sleeping in the room next door. I'm really concerned about their safety, their security, as a mother would be. I'm thinking my career as a covert officer is over. I'm thinking about the people that I had worked with, and you guarantee them that you will do everything in your power to protect them. So all this is going through my head in, you know, the first 30 seconds. And what followed was, the only way I can describe it is like falling down Alice's rabbit hole, where white is black and black is white. And people are talking about these people, Valerie Plame and Joe Wilson, on TV and the radio and in the newspapers, and they have nothing to do with us or who we were or our characters. And I wasn't a completely naive person, but I certainly was not a Washington insider. I wasn't a particularly political person. And the next few years, I had a very steep learning curve. As it said, it really is a blood sport. There were those that wanted to go to the mat to protect the president and Scooter Libby and Cheney, no matter what. And as I've said over and over again, but it's worth saying again, I served my country as an American. I didn't serve as a Democrat. I didn't serve as a Republican. And anyone serving overseas, whether they're in the military forces or in the State Department or any other capacity, typically you're not there in any sort of partisan role. You're there to advance a shared U.S. interest around the world. And that's what that leaves such a bitter taste, that it turned into such a crazy partisan, goat rope.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, thank you, Valerie. I appreciate that. Moving through to the next step, I suppose. Late September 2003, the Justice Department opens an investigation into the leak of your identity. The case is assigned to Special Counsel Patrick Fitzgerald. October, several journalists, among them Judith Miller, who I'm familiar with, and Matthew Cooper of Time Magazine, are subpoenaed to testify. And then one more thing, then I'll have a question at the end, I promise. And then
this is all, backfill. You got to story.
I got to send all the exposition.
Memory.
Exactly. July 6th, Matthew Cooper of Time Magazine agrees to testify before the grand jury after receiving a personal waiver from his source, who we have to intrude the name Scooter Libby at this point. I suppose I'll ask, after all that bluster, if you suspected Libby before for the testimony.
No, I didn't. And here's why. I didn't follow who's who in the White House. I found out in real time, like everyone else. I thought the special prosecutor, Patrick Fitzgerald, truly a man of integrity. He followed where the facts led, did what he could do. I wish he had brought more more indictments and then convictions, but
yes,
many prosecutors don't want to walk into a courtroom unless they know they have at least a 85% chance of conviction. And he did move forward, of course, with Scooter Libby. But no, none of these, I learned with everyone else. I mean, I didn't rove through the halls of the White House. I had no idea who Cheney was, that's what Libby was called, Scooter Libby. And for, who's a grown man working in the White House called Scooter? Like, I don't know. It just became, I was reading this stuff in the front page of the Washington Post along with everyone else. And it really was a traitorous breach of national security. And I do believe that those around Bush really wanted to protect him. So I don't really know what he knew. I mean, if any good staff is going to protect their principal, and Scooter Libby was the designated to, take the fall.
Right. The patsy, I guess, would be the word.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So then March 2007, Scooter Libby is found guilty on 4 of the 5 counts, including obstruction of justice, making false statements, and perjury. Later on that same year, in July, President Bush, Bush Jr., of course, commutes Libby's 30-month prison sentence, does not grant him a full pardon. That comes later, unfortunately, with President Trump. Yeah, and then later on in 2007, I believe September 8th, if my info is correct, you filed a civil lawsuit against Libby, Cheney, and other officials, alleging a conspiracy to discredit and retaliate against you. So if you'll allow me one dumb question, Valerie, hopefully.
No dumb questions.
Thank you. What made you file the lawsuit given the potential blowback? I mean, we're talking about a vice president that you're tangling with, among others, right?
Yeah. Two things. One, I think it was filed in 2006, but that doesn't really matter. I recall Joe and I had several intense conversations over this. He was, by his nature, is much more, he wants to be the one when the bully is putting the finger in the chest to push back. And he saw the Bush White House as just nothing more than bullies. And I, by the nature of my professional life and being discreet and just my personality, I'm less confrontational. But I realized a great wrong had been done. Certainly my career was over. Joe's professional career had been utterly sabotaged by, charges of treason and traitorous behavior and all sorts of derogatory phrases flung for both of us. So the civil suit was a way of trying to amend that, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they declined to hear it. So I'm not a lawyer. But what I do understand is that those in power hold tightly to the precedent still stands that you can disparage someone, or you can order up a IRS audit, as of course happened with Comey and under Trump, and there's very little, I'm looking for the right word, the legal word. There's very little that you can do about it in terms of legally holding someone to account in those sort of circumstances. You can't address it.
Right. No, I understand that. And that leads me to want to ask you the question of, I would imagine, perhaps you can help me flesh out the question as we go, but I would imagine that if you're looking to join the CIA, you're someone like me, for instance, that might think of it as a viable career option, and I want to become an operative. I would imagine a lot of that would involve trust. And you can probably guess where I'm going here is, why would I want to join an agency that might breach me? So I'm curious what you think, what happened to you affected other people that might want to join, might want to serve the country in that way. Does my question make sense?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Absolutely. You got right to the heart of it. Of course, if you cannot trust your own government to protect you and support you, then what's the point? And not only that, look at foreign assets who watched that, because it was global news for a while. It was crazy for a while there, white hot. And if I were someone with insider information about Putin's circle, do I necessarily want to go to the CIA knowing that my identity might be betrayed, or that my family would be hurt, whatever? So they're like, no, I'm going to go sell it to the Estonians or whatever. And so there were multiple layers of betrayal and why it was so wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Given the media firestorm, I remember it as it happened. It was far before I became politically interested or aware. But it was pretty much the only story on the planet for some time, or at least it felt like it.
Try being in the middle of it. Trust me.
Well, that was actually my question. Was you went from being, there's a bit of a humorous irony to it. You went from being, having a secret identity to having your identity all but known to everybody. What was it like being in the middle of that media firestorm? How did you navigate it? Or was it all a blur?
It was just more, honestly, it was mortifying. And I think I was in shock for a couple of years. I never, ever wanted to be a public person. That's not something that appealed to me. Obviously, I'm working for the CIA. You get your satisfaction from your colleagues, maybe that, or, an attaboy, they know what you're doing. But being a public person had no appeal. I'm grateful that a lot of this took place before social media really started gaining traction, because it was horrific and intrusive enough. It had it was so hard in our marriage as well, because the pressure wasn't just on one half of the partnership, it was on both of us, and in different ways. And we had small children that we were trying to raise and keep them somewhat insulated from this madness. Looking back, and I only had the chance to do this really in the last few years, where COVID, of course, forced all of us to reassess and reprioritize and to be quiet for a while. And it was the first time I realized in almost 20 years that I was able to really unpack what had happened. We were just moving so fast. And it's not good for your soul, to say the least. It's not, I don't care how many film openings you can go to, or, covers of magazines you might get. None of that actually fills you in a meaningful way.
Right. I understand that. Thank you, Valerie. Yes, imagine if the leak happened in the age of Twitter. My goodness.
Oh, it would just have been, it just, yeah, add a whole other circle of Dante's hell to what was already difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very curious to get your thoughts here, Valerie. If you could say anything you wanted to any of them, but Novak, Rove, Libby, Armitage, and they had to listen to you, what would you say?
How dare you? How dare you try to misdirect the attention of America to two patriots when it really should have been on the decision making of the Bush administration and the decision to go to war in Iraq. I think many of them that were involved, it's a strong term, but it's applicable. They're war criminals in what they advocated for. And look at Iraq today. Are we any better off? This is in no way a recommendation for Saddam Hussein, but what did we learn from that? Can we really bring democracy to other countries with military force?
Yes.
Do we really know how to occupy a country? It was not the Marshall Plan that did work in Europe. It's not analogous, very different reasons. But I'm afraid we haven't really absorbed those lessons.
I think I would feel as you do. I interviewed a while back. I interviewed a political scientist named Bruce Brenos de Mesquita. We were discussing totalitarian regimes, and the word we stumbled on as we were talking about Iraq specifically was ornamental democracy. We sort of imposed the simulacrum of democracy,
Yes.
but it wasn't embraced properly as it was in the case of the Marshall Plan.
Indeed, because again, not analogous at all. And with the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq in March of this year, 2023, there were some articles that looked back, sort of where are they now? All these men, and it was mostly men, with a few exceptions, that pushed for war for more, I would say, ideological reasons, of a desire to expand America's military footprint across the Middle East, to keep Israel safe. Okay, that's a noble cause, but at what terrible cost, not only to our own servicemen and women, but what about the millions of what are the numbers of displaced Iraqis?
Yeah.
Killed, wounded, deeply traumatized as humans. And we won't even talk about Afghanistan, but just in Iraq, a terrible foreign policy decision.
I completely agree. I have one more question, if I may, Valerie, on Iraq, and then I'll move on. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on. I suspect you'll be familiar with the name Christopher Hitchens.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What do you think of Christopher Hitchens' argument that we had to intervene in Iraq to satisfy a UN mandate?
Brilliant writer, and I respected his intellect for sure. But on this, he was just wrong. And yes, he was leading the intellectual charge for why. And you could spend all day yammering about it, but it's not worth it. He was wrong. And time has told that to be the truth.
Yes, agreed. Absolutely. Thank you, Valerie. So then what prompted you to write the book Fair Game?
It was an attempt to make sense of some of the stuff I had lived through. And also it was the first time that I got to speak for myself rather than because I still worked at the CIA a few years after the leak of my name. I wanted to get a certain amount of time in, but I resigned. Anyway, so Joe was either speaking for me or, new articles about me that got things wrong. So I wanted it was a very selfish exercise. It's like, here's what's happened. It's like if I sat down with you and we had a great bottle of wine, at the end of the bottle would be that story.
Hmm. Sure, sure. Um, excuse me. So then, how were you involved with the movie of the same name?
Uh, well, we were very lucky by the people that became involved in the movie. Doug Lyman, who did the Bourne Identity and Mr. and Mrs. Smith, he was a director, and he's become a good friend, and he continues to make amazing movies. And two brothers, English writers, John Henry and Jez Butterworth, were the writers of the script, and I felt very fortunate to have them on board. So Joe and I took turns going onto the set. We became friendly with Sean and Naomi. And because we were scared to death that they would somehow like distort the story in ways and once you give up your life rights, how scary is that to like sell someone your life rights? Oh my God, they can say and do anything. But we were fortunate in that they had integrity. They had that they cared about the truth. So I think it's a good movie. It still holds up. It's not stupid. My daughter just told me she saw it the other night. She's seen it before, but not really as a young adult that she is.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. I want to talk about your espionage conference. So this is called Spies, Lies, and Nukes. You'll be putting it on in November in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where you live. That's going to run from the 10th to the 12th of this year. And among them is former KGB spy Jack Barsky, who our listeners will have heard me interview by the time this goes out. So please tell our listeners why you're putting on and what it's about.
Sure, thank you. So this will be our third running. We're back. Last year we did it in Tucson, but the specter of COVID was still hovering over us. We didn't really know if we'd do it or not. So we're so happy to be back at La Fonda on the Plaza, which is downtown Santa Fe. It's November 10th through 12th. And I'm so proud of our speakers. I started this honestly as just a way for me to get to talk to my former colleagues. Hey, want to come to Santa Fe? And I miss them. I miss my career. I miss my colleagues. So I've added some new people in, and these are people that I know have really done the work. They have real integrity. They are legendary. They've done all different sorts of things, from disguise in the CIA to recruiting Russians to nuclear stuff, social media influence stuff. So I love my lineup. I'm really proud of it. As you mentioned, Jack will be there as well. He's a new addition. I think of him as sort of the real life character from The Americans, that great TV show with Kerry Russell.
Yep.
And so it's for the general public. We have a lot of people, educated people that care about national security and espionage, but it's an intimate conference. This is not the Comic-Con of espionage. It's well done. It's intimate. You can talk to these CIA heroes in my eyes. And it's in a great place, Santa Fe. So for your listeners, they can go to spiesliesnukes.com and find tickets and all the information they need there. And I hope they do. I'm really excited for this year. It's going to be, I always have fun, but every year gets easier and better.
Brilliant. I love it. I love it, Valerie. And I'll make sure I leave the pertinent links in the show notes here. Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, and I'll share the enthusiasm. Among your guests also will be the great Mary Beth Long, who I'm familiar with. I know you were on panel with her. And
yes,
you mentioned disguises. The great Joanna Mendez will be on as well.
She's terrific. She and her husband, he's gone now, Tony Mendez, they were both at different times chief of CIA disguise. Their book is the one that Ben Affleck pulled on for Argo, that terrific movie about getting the hostages out of Iran during the revolution. She has I could just listen to her stories all day long about what they did to make sure that CIA officers are safe on the streets of Moscow, or at least could, if not safe, could at least make a secure meeting with the most sensitive assets we have. And she's got a great sense of humor and tells great stories. So that'll be fun.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Valerie. I'm keeping an eye on our time. But I'd love to touch a little bit on your run at Congress. In particular, I think some of the best political ads I've ever seen in my life. You driving the car and so forth.
Yeah,
Maybe
backwards.
backwards. And you said something to the effect of they really do teach us this or something. Could you talk through what made you want to run through Congress? And I really would love to hear about the commercials.
I don't
as well.
know. I must have been hit by an asteroid or something. I don't know. The truth is, a seat opened up in northern New Mexico where I lived at the time. Very unusual. And I thought I can do that job. And I'd like to do that job because I want to serve my country. And I love northern New Mexico, and I have a lot of things to offer. So I ran my campaign with heart and guts, and about $1.5 million of dark money came in against me in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. Thank you, Citizens United. And it was in some ways a very painful experience. I'm glad I did it. It was sort of scratching the itch, if you will, something I wanted to try. Turns out I really like policy, and I really care about people and how to make a positive changes in their lives. Turns out I hate politics, and there's a difference. There's a big difference. Given where we are today in this country, it's surprising that anyone wants to run because it can be an extremely painful and intrusive process. But I'm glad I did it, and I tried it. I ran with my heart. I ran a clean campaign, and it didn't work out. And now I get to live with remarried, very happy, and get to put on spy conferences and do other things.
Wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then were the ads your idea?
Oh, well, the ad maker was terrific, Mark Putnam, who is like the Oscar winner of political ads. And we collaborated on that. He's a perfectionist. I had to do that J turn about 42 or 43 times. I was really tired at the end of the day. But yes, they do teach us that. Then I did another ad for him, and I was doing all sorts of like an obstacle course. Let's just say there's not enough Advil in the world at the end of that day. But it was, you have to break through. There's so much noise, and you do these TV ads in the hope that it is memorable and people go, oh yeah, Valerie Plame. I think she would, what I hope goes into their head is like, yeah, she would really fight for us. She would be really a good representative of ours in Congress. But it didn't work out. So, there you go.
Yeah, well, then that's okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Valerie. I just have 2 questions left, and then you're no longer my prisoner, okay? So I know I've kept you a long time. I just want to ask you, is there anything else you want to make sure that you get out while we're talking? I'd like to give you that opportunity now.
Oh, thank you. Because I've been putting so much work on it, spies-nukes.com. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak with you this past hour.
Oh, that's my pleasure, Valerie. No, I'm grateful to you for seeing my email and better yet, responding to it. So Valerie Plame, how can people find out about you?
I do have my own website. It's valerieplame.com, which is really just a place where I throw stuff I've written or so forth. But spies-nukes.com also is a way to find me as well. If anyone
Excellent.
wants to reach out, you can contact us through that website.
Excellent. Valerie, this was such a pleasure. I'm so grateful to you for speaking with me. Thank you for the time.
My pleasure. You've made it so easy and so fun, and a kind of a little weird walk down memory lane.